Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining New England Interstate Water Pollution Control Commission's debut research webinar. My name is Mike Jennings. I'm a Senior Program Manager here at New England Interstate. We're very pleased to have over 100 attendees listening in this afternoon. Over the coming year, we will periodically present findings and outcomes from an array of our water-related research projects. And the best way to stay informed about these upcoming webinars will be to follow us on Twitter via @NEIWPCC, and I'll have that up again at the end as well. Before we get to today's technical presentation, I'd like to share some information about New England Interstate Water Pollution Control Commission for those who may not be familiar with us. We were established in 1947 by an act of Congress. We're one of 6 congressionally authorized, nationally recognized interstate agencies. We are a nonprofit organization with our central office located in Lowell, Massachusetts, and our compact member states comprise New York State and the New England states as well. New England Interstate Water Pollution Control Commission's mission lays that out again. The key point I'd like you to take away from this slide is that we serve and assist our member states by providing coordination, public education, research, training, and leadership. And I think today's webinar touches on all of those. This project itself originated within New England Interstate Water Pollution Control Commission's Hudson River programs. We've worked in partnership with the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation for over 15 years now. We do that through 2 distinct contracts with New York State. Currently, we have over $14 million in commitment from them, and that will extend our efforts through 2020. And we do that in 2 distinct programs, the Hudson River Estuary Program and the Hudson River National Estuarine Research Reserve. For the Estuary Program, we have 8 full-time staff working in 3 office locations in New York State. They have an approximately $2 million annual budget, and their focus, as you can see here, is on resource management, climate change, green infrastructure, education, and access associated with the estuary, the tidally influenced portions of the Hudson River. The Research Reserve has 3 full-time staff located at the Norrie Point Environmental Center, which is in Statsburg, New York. They're a little bit smaller operation, so they're about a $300,000 annual budget and effort. And they're looking at research on sustainable shoreline, stewardship, conservation, sea level rise, many of the efforts that the Research Reserve Program is working on throughout the country. At this point, I would have turned it over to Kristin, and I'm going to make one more cursory check here and see if she is on, and I can hopefully load her up if she is, so bear with me for 1 second. I see her now, so this will just take a moment. Oh, Kristin, I still see you don't have a phone next to your name, so you still need to put in the star number pound to actually get connected through the phone system. Kristin and Jessica, Kristin Marcel from New York State DEC's Estuary Program and Jessica Fain from the New York City Department of Planning are a couple of select project partners that are going to say a word or 2, and maybe if I don't upset the apple cart too much, I could have Jessica go first while Kristin still connects through the audio portion of the conference. Jessica, if you wouldn't mind unmuting your phone.
Sure, no problem. Hi, everyone. This is Jessica Fain. I'm a planner in the New York City Department of City Planning, focusing on waterfront planning. We were really excited when DEC engaged the city early on to help guide and advance this work. We were really eager to participate. Getting a better grasp of what coastal green infrastructure can do for resiliency, coastal protection, and ecological improvement in New York City is something that the city has identified as critical, particularly following Hurricane Sandy. It was in its post-Sandy report, A Stronger, More Resilient New York, the City of New York identified coastal green infrastructure as a priority topic, and so we've been really excited to be able to engage with this work.
Okay, thank you. And again, my apologies. I have one person who is not quite 100% connected in. Kristin, as I had said, you need to use the star ## to connect in. And if you wouldn't mind working on that, and then we will give you an opportunity at the end to say an opening remark and also help us through the next step portion of the presentation. My apologies to all on the line. Before I turn this over to Hugh Roberts from ARCADIS, who's joining us from the Centennial State today, I wanted to say that we have the chat function enabled, so if anybody has any questions along the way, feel free to put them in via the chat function. And when we get to the end, we believe that we will have an opportunity for some questions and answers, and I will run through the questions in the order that they were received. So at this point, I'd like to welcome Hugh, and actually I need to turn the, bear with me again, this is our debut, so we're still working out the bugs. But I'm going to turn control of the presentation over to Hugh.
Good turnout, 145 people.
Hugh, if you wouldn't mind unmuting your phone if you have it muted. And if there are others on the line that have an open line, please mute that as well. But Hugh, if you're able to, you're in, you have control.
Great. Thank you, Mike. I'm going to test the slides and make sure this moves quick. All right. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mike, for the introduction, and Jessica, and certainly look forward to Kristin's words as well. And thank you all for being on. The count is at about 150 participants. So it's great to see this turnout. Certainly appreciate the opportunity to be able to speak to everybody about this research plan, share what we've learned, and hopefully continue to drive excitement towards furthering the science and the conversation around coastal green infrastructure. As Mike mentioned, I'm Hugh Roberts. I'm with ARCADIS. I lead our numerical modeling, our surface water practice nationally, and one of our leaders in our water management and integrated planning practice, really focusing on a range of water management services from flood to drought or water quality related. Of course, my contact information is here. If you have any questions about the presentation, feel free to reach out to myself, or of course you have Kristin and Jessica's contact, and as Mike showed, also NEIWPCC contact information. And this, unfortunately, I put a picture up, well, so you can see who's talking for the next 45 minutes and at least have some sense of reference. But also I have to warn you, many who know me know that I like to use graphics-heavy presentations, and today is certainly not one of those. So I tried to sneak in graphics where I could. I'm presenting today really on behalf of a large team. ARCADIS led this, and Haihong Zhou was the primary author really behind all of this in terms of the literature review, organizing, pulling this together. There was a very big team, however, with direct support, of course, as part of the project team, in addition to DEC and DCP and NEIWPCC. From the Stevens Institute of Technology, there was a handful of folks there who were very integral into the progress. Then there was a tremendous amount of in-kind services from New York City Parks, Escape Landscape, the Nature Conservancy, and Matthews Nielsen, landscape architects. And this team provided information everywhere from helping write some of the chapters, or in some cases like Jamie Ong, actually really leading the writing of some parts of the chapters, to reviews, to pulling in different experts. And without this team, this certainly would not have been possible. Before I get into some of the details, I did want to just show this for those who haven't had a chance to see the actual plan, what we're summarizing in today's presentation. I just want to make sure everybody knew this plan is available online. It's posted at the DEC website. I also believe that we posted, or is already posted at the NEIWPCC website. At the DEC website, you can see here on the screen, there's a summary of the plan, and there's a hyperlink in purple for the Coastal Green Infrastructure Research Plan. So you could download a PDF. It's a fairly sizable document, but you could be able to sort through and really appreciate some of the details that we're unable to cover in today's presentation. So the goal of the project, at the onset, the goal was, we discussed how we were going to tackle this, and really that the target was to develop a research plan to advance the understanding of benefits and costs for coastal green infrastructure, and the ultimate goal being able to use that to help with the selection, and selection not only of project sites, but maybe project characteristics, and implementation. So how do we make these projects more successful, and how do we get enough information to support this project analysis so that we can advance through, say, the regulatory process, with the ultimate goal of improving resiliency in New York City, and resiliency really from a hazard mitigation and, say, an ecosystem standpoint. So the strategies that we focused on for this for this research plan were wetlands and maritime forests, reefs, and I would say constructed reefs, and we say constructed in rather than restored areas. Where are we constructing relatively new or new features? Breakwater islands, which I'll talk about in more detail, but these are essentially large island complexes. Channel shallowing, for those who are aware of what was done with the Special Initiative for Rebuilding and Resiliency, this might ring a bell. This was a concept of how can we maybe naturally shallow some areas to change, say, the tidal prism and ultimately potentially provide benefits in a somewhat natural way. Ecologically enhanced bulkheads and revetments, and then living shorelines. So what are the treatments along the shore's edge from a coastal green infrastructure standpoint that can improve resiliency? So our methodology, kind of the foundation of all this was the literature review. And if for those who are able to see or review the PDF in more detail, you'll see that there's hundreds of articles or project write-ups that are cited and reviewed to try to understand not only what was happening or is happening in New York, but what's happening in the U.S. Of course, there's some advancements, for instance, in the Everglades or in Louisiana or California that are very applicable to in New York, but also globally. There's some examples of data management that are really powerful globally. So how do we pull this together through a literature review? A handful of team discussions, not only ourselves within our team, including DCP and DEC, but also reaching out to experts. So there's experts, of course, in the community at large, both scientifically, who are the experts advancing the science around the ecosystem benefits or hazard mitigation, but who are the local experts, who are the people who understand where the data are, who are the people that are commonly working with these projects, whether in a scientific or a regulatory standpoint. Additionally, we had workshops. So there was 3 workshops. There was a workshop at the initiation of the project where many agencies got together, discussed where they were on this topic, discussed what they've done post-Sandy or otherwise, really make sure everyone's on the same page in terms of how to pull all that information into this study. Now, partway through the study, we also realized that certainly there's a scientific side of this, but there's also the regulatory side of this, where any advancements we would be trying to achieve with coastal green infrastructure, we recognize in order to meet that goal that we stated of implementation, we need to make sure to align the science and the policy. And so there was certainly a regulatory workshop focused on that, and then follow-up conversations around the regulatory framework. And last but not least, we had a workshop last October, and that's the image that's on the screen. We had over 40 participants, over 19 agencies and universities. Everyone got together. We had, at that point in time, we had a draft version of the research plan that I'll present here in a little more detail. In the October meeting, it was a 4-hour workshop, and we went through the details of what we had studied to date, what we recommended as some of our research agendas. We reprioritized some of those agendas. We adjusted those agendas based on input from the different agencies, and one of the things that I appreciated the most is we were able to also add agendas based on feedback from the larger group, the group that hopefully will be taking this type of science and advancing it moving forward from here. And then last but not least, once we completed the workshop, we completed our document, went through multiple reviews with the DEC, DCP, and others who were able to participate in that review, and finalized the document last December. So the focus areas for our study for those 6 green infrastructure strategies were hazard mitigation potential, so looking at what is the potential to improve resiliency from, say, a long-term or a gradual impact, things like shoreline erosion. And also a single episodic impact, so large events like Sandy, or maybe even somewhere in between daily conditions in the Sandy, a more frequent storm event. What are the benefits of these types of projects? To understand the potential ecological benefits and, of course, costs and habitat trade-offs that go along with that. Understand the possible failure causes. So, for instance, in a wetland, are wetlands in parts of New York or in the area, are they able to accrete either from a mineral standpoint or from an organic standpoint sufficiently to keep up with sea level rise? Or are there potential failure concerns out there for each of these that we need to be aware of. And then, of course, data behind all this. So trying to understand what do we know in terms of the science, but also where do we have data to support that, or where can we improve on that data to aid in the design and the planning and implementation of these types of projects moving forward. The report structure, and I list this report structure not only to lay out how we did the report, but also we'll follow the report structure on the upcoming slides for today's presentation. But the report structure was really broken down into the 4 primary categories. So we started by introducing the regulatory considerations to kind of lay that general framework out to understand how we are trying to operate in concert with that in our review. We broke down from a scientific standpoint, really, and in some cases, maybe on the policy and regulatory side, the 6 CGI strategies. So what is the state of the science? What do we know? What do we not know about these 6 different strategies? And then also took the data, the monitoring, and the integration part, so any sort of data gaps maybe we would have for these 6 strategies, we put all that together in a single report chapter. And the reason for that is what you'll find, and you'll see that even throughout today's presentation, that many of the needs and many of the research agenda items come back to data availability, quality of data, ability to access it and share it in a consistent way. And so we brought all of these integration and data pieces into one chapter to really drive home the need for that advancement. And then last, and certainly not least, are the research agenda items. So at the end of the report, we break down into two different setups, or 2 different meta and strategy-specific research agendas, which I'll get into later in the presentation. So an overview of each of the report chapters, starting with regulatory. The lessons that we learned from the regulatory review was that there are certainly success stories from other states. Some states, for instance, really the way the regulatory framework is set up, there's an opportunity to implement living shorelines more readily. And so the framework supports that. So there's some lessons to be learned from those states. They may not all apply to New York, but there are things to take home. One of the things that we certainly learned consistently across the board is that there aren't easy assessments for hazard mitigation and ecological benefits of these type of projects. So something more on the gray side of things, levees and flood walls, there's for the most part a generally understood certain amount of resiliency or flood protection that can be provided. There's some ways to quantify that. There's not as a direct assessment, of course, with these types of strategies, and that can be an issue at some points of the regulatory process. Also understanding the habitat evaluation trade-off. So how are habitats the trade-off? How is one maybe more favorable than another, or how is the impact on one? How does that compare to another? And trying to understanding that habitat trade-off is critically important, of course, in the regulatory process. And then finally, last but not least, the pilot studies are something that really came up in a lot of the conversations and kind of came back with our expert reviews, is the need to have pilot studies to help simplify the regulatory process, so to have data, to have something to be able to point to show the cost, to show the benefit, and to use that as a means to streamline the regulatory process. Specifically getting into now the 6 CGI strategies. For the 6, I'll have a little more detail of the wetlands and maritime forests. And the reason for that is that the wetlands and maritime forests, when we describe these, we're describing these as sort of individual units, but the reality is when we did a literature review around wetlands and maritime forests and other vegetation types, the information about drag and vegetal resistance, it applies across many of these strategies. So, for instance, the breakwater islands, if they're vegetated, there's some applicability of what you would learn in a literature review around wetlands, same with living shorelines, or even some different ecological enhancements. What we learned from a hazard mitigation standpoint is that laboratory and numerical model studies are certainly the most common. Field measurements are relatively rare, and that really comes down to the cost of those measurements, especially during when there's events where we're deploying these immediately before something like Sandy, and also the challenge of collecting data during certain events, again, like Sandy, not only because of having to deploy in advance of a storm, have funding procured and set aside in advance of the storm to be able to build the devices, to get them out, collect the data, and of course not have them fail during large events. There ends up being a relatively rare data set compared to, say, some of the data points we could use from numerical models or other lab experiments. The other thing we learned, and of course this is something where there's a lot of advancement that can be made in terms of furthering these understandings, is that the resistance from vegetation is, of course, dependent on what we're calling internal factors, so things like stem density, the size of a marsh, the footprint, how fragmented that marsh might be, and external factors, so things like water depth, water column height, that would impact how flow would move in and around these features. And we won't go through this table, but this was my attempt to try to get something that resembled a graphic, of course, in here, and also just really point to this in the report. I think this is one of the really more powerful sections of the report, of the amount of data that we were able to pull together in the literature review to try to understand how do we know the correlation, or how do we as a scientific community appreciate the correlation between these internal and external factors, which are the most important, and then, of course, how do we think about these moving forward to advance the science. On the ecological benefit side for wetlands and maritime forests, back to kind of the regulatory discussion, is there needs to be a quantification and comparison. So one of the things that we can do to advance the science is have a better way to quantify and compare habitat values. To be able, we also can advance the science as it relates to the CGI strategy by improving the existing habitat value tools and models and metrics, and doing it in a consistent way across different agencies and different projects. And of course, again, and I actually won't put this on each of the slides, but this does apply for every slide, is that, for instance, pilot projects are certainly recommended to collect data and to test the hypotheses we have for different ecological benefits, for hazard mitigation benefits, and to support the permitting process. For reefs, the take-home messages we really had for reefs are first, certainly, that from a hazard mitigation standpoint, wave dissipation is not as standard as traditional breakwaters. And you can see in the bottom left picture the form and the structure of some of these reefs. They're variable. Material type is different. It's certainly different than building a breakwater with large stones of certain dimensions. And so, how can we advance this as a scientific community? How can we improve our understanding of the wave dissipation potential of these reefs? Of course, the ecosystem benefits similar to wetlands can be better understood, and there is some guidance out there for the siting and the design and the monitoring of these, and especially as it relates to oysters. So there is a fair amount of literature out there related to that. The last bullet is really focusing on what are the potential failure mechanisms. So reefs we know are susceptible to many things, but one thing to keep in mind, of course, in the Northeast and in the New York area, the focus of our study is there's also, for instance, ice is an impact that we need to be aware of. So when we start to think about how do we design these, we need to be aware of all these external factors that could potentially impact the long-term sustainability and success of these projects. The breakwater islands, and this is a graphic on the right to give you an idea of what we mean by scale, and you can actually see the marina back behind it. So the breakwater island would be a fairly large complex, certainly larger than a reef, though many of, say, the wave dissipation studies that are out there related to breakwater islands are breakwaters, are applicable to breakwater islands. And again, the vegetation information that we had from the wetland study are also applicable. These benefits certainly vary widely based on project scale and the type of structure. And many of the lessons learned can be taken from reefs or breakwaters or vegetation. One thing to note is certainly one thing that sets this apart from other strategies is that there needs to be a large sediment, not only to build this, there needs to be a stable sediment environment for projects like these to be sustainable over the long term. And so you'll see when we get into some of the research agenda items, for instance, having improved information related to sediment transport and sediment budget in the area and availability of sediment to actually build these projects is critical. Channel shallowing, and I won't speak to this too much, and I actually won't really speak to the research agenda items around this at the end of the presentation, but this is something that I certainly would welcome if folks are interested in this, discussing this down the road, or potentially even involving Philip Orton, who's from Stevens Institute of Technology, who really led this part of the study. The concept of channel shallowing, and you can see it in the bottom left corner, the idea would be to either in a natural way or in a fill way, by placing fill, allowing channels to fill in so that the water depth is less. And by doing that, there is an impact, of course, on the tidal prism. And depending on the geometry of the basin that you're operating in, there is a potential for reduction in storm surge levels and a potential improvement in some ecosystem integrity. Though there, of course, are some things that need to be understood, for instance, navigation limitations or what would be the impact on water quality. So the applicability of these are certainly very site-specific, but just kind of understanding the opportunity and whether it exists in New York is something we wanted to look into as part of this study. For ecological enhancements of bulkheads and revetments, one of the findings that was certainly most interesting to me from this part of the study was that Portland concrete, I think it's something around 50% of the coastline is made up of Portland concrete, and that is highly basic. That potentially leaches toxins into the water, and the surface, for instance, is not great in terms of recruitment of species. By lowering the pH and texturizing, we can improve that. Though some of the findings we had, and this is really also led by the Stevens Institute of Technology, some of the findings are the initiation of a project is important because not only the survival of, say, vegetation when you have different plantings, but also the risk of ice. And this is specifically, say, up in the Hudson River, which was part of our study area, is there is a chance, and there are some examples that we know from projects where the placement of this was poorly timed, and either because of extreme weather or because of ice, there were some uprootings and loss of some of the project vegetation. And one other thing to point out is at the time of the study, there was no standard design guidelines. And there's some folks, of course, many of you might be aware of the work that's being done by MWA for the wedge studies. There are these types of guidelines being developed out there, and that's great to see in terms of furthering the science and the conversation around how to design and implement these different strategies. The last strategy is living shorelines, and we have some very similar, though in some cases unique findings with the bulkheads and revetments. For shorelines, we focus on sill types, so you can see on the bottom a graphic of what this looks like. You have your land on the left. There's a transition zone with wetlands at high tide to mid-tide to low tide, with the sand fill area between the far edge of the sill and the land. And so that this, for instance, the height of the sill or the window, the opening along the sill, how big these are, those are some of the things we looked into. Some of the things that are, of course, of interest in terms of optimizing and improving the design of these kind of structures, as well as knowing some of the external factors, just like bulkheads and revetments, things like ice and wakes, the damage. So what are the external factors that would impact the long-term sustainability of these projects? And again, similar to bulkheads and revetments, no standard design guidelines really were available at the time of this study. So moving forward to data management. Data management, again, this was our attempt to take the lessons learned from the 6 strategies and pull that data or those lessons learned into one central location to understand where are the possibilities to improve not only our understanding of these individual projects, but doing it by intelligently managing our data across agencies and across groups. And so we began to look at what are lessons learned from other projects. There are some examples in the Gulf. There's some examples in Europe where many data sets, in terms of coastal zone management data sets, lessons learned from projects, success stories in different implementations or failures. In Louisiana, for instance, there's a large data management network called the CRIMS Data Network that is available statewide, where there's been a tremendous advancement in the state of the science, specifically into the state of the Louisiana coast, because of the very dense data availability across the coast. And it can, not only data that's available, but important to note is that it's, of course, available in a consistent way, so that as scientists begin to use this information, they can begin to use it across different models, across different groups in a consistent way. So we identified as part of this chapter of the study some of the baseline data needs that are out there, some of these things, for instance, on the hydrodynamic side, or again, with the ice and the wake, some of the external factors that impact the success of these strategies were identified, as well as things like vegetation biomechanics. So what do we know about healthy marshes or some fragmented or unhealthy marshes? What do we know about some of the vegetation that is out there, or other ecosystem indicators like species abundance? We also looked into and discussed the integration of data. So not only data but monitoring. So how can where are the lessons that what are the lessons that can be learned from other studies, whether in New York or outside, in terms of pulling all this data together and pulling the science together to make sure that the advancement of these strategies is integrated across different groups, across different agencies, to really maximize what we can learn moving forward. And of course, one of the mechanisms, and I'll discuss this in the research agenda items in a few slides, is a conceptual model. So a non-quantitative planning tool intended to really to synchronize the different pieces that go into the decision around implementation of these projects. So what do we understand to be critical aspects of the science? What are the data requirements? And again, what are the policies and the interaction across agencies? And by building a conceptual model that multiple agencies, multiple universities, other partners all recognize and contribute to and continue to advance and develop over time is a potentially very powerful integration platform for advancing the science around these strategies. Additionally, kind of tied to potentially the conceptual model would be a monitoring program. So how can we set up a monitoring program that is consistent across these projects, consistent across agencies, so that data can be gathered from these projects and shared at a regional basis, and taking that site-specific data and getting it up to a centralized platform as well. So moving into the research agenda, we broke the research agenda into two groups, and I have to thank the Nature Conservancy for this idea. When we sat down and we finished our literature review, we had our punch list of items of what are the critical items, what are the things that we need to better understand, and how do we build these agendas. They're just like the literature review, where we had science around each of the six strategies, and then had the kind of separate discussion around data management and implementation. There became two kind of very clear groups for the research strategy. One is we're calling meta strategies. So the meta strategy being what are research agenda items that can be constructed that would really help for any or all of the six CGI strategies. There's some other strategy-specific research items. So, for instance, vegetative drag from wetlands. How can we improve our understanding of that specific strategy, and what can we do within the science and moving forward with the research agendas to improve our understanding? The way that we set these up, and I'll show you in the next slides, is not only do we break them into groups, but then we tried to score them so that we could give an idea to folks who would potentially take this plan and begin to advance it, some guidance in terms of how we're thinking about the challenges or the benefits associated with these different research agenda items. So we scored them using 4 different criteria. The first was fundamental principles, and we scored that essentially meaning whether any sort of research associated with a given research agenda, would it advance the fundamental principles behind, or the fundamental science behind these strategies, or is it something that's more applicable to organizing the understanding, say, in the New York community? Chronology is really, it's defined as a dependency on other projects. So the chronology, you would get a high score, for instance, if this is something that can be done in isolation, versus a lower score for something that would require other steps in advance of being able to move this study forward. There's a regional applicability. So again, some of these topics are very broad in nature, but some of them are very specific. So, for instance, one of the questions that came up, and I'll discuss in more detail, is some of these questions we have about vegetation. Can we learn more specifics about the vegetation in New York, and how those vegetation impact the resiliency in the area? Last but not least is affordability, and we didn't put together, for instance, costs for these plans, but what we what we tried to do is give essentially a higher score for something in relative terms would be more affordable to actually do, to develop a project and to advance research agendas, whereas something with a higher cost, and a higher cost would maybe be associated with things like data collection or very time-intensive tasks. Those would have a lower rating on an affordability scale. One other data point we use to really guide the prioritization, and the details of what's on the screen aren't really important so much as just kind of the relative nature of it, but in order to guide which research agenda items are most important or critical to New York City in the eyes of the stakeholders, the people who attended that final workshop in October, we sent out a poll. We had a fairly good turnout and response for the poll, and what we did is we didn't give a ranking just like the 4 criteria that were on the previous slide. Rather, we just asked folks to rank these relative to one another to get an idea of which projects and which strategies would be most impactful to their agencies or in their mind from a scientific or regulatory standpoint. We use that as a data point to then build out this final table. So if you have a chance to look at the research agenda and look at the actual document, what you'll find is that at the conclusion of the document, there is a summary of all of our research agendas. And I'm going to go through each of them one by one through the next 15 minutes to kind of highlight some of the critical, maybe not critical, but some of the items that we would want to highlight. And the reason I chose these is because you can see the way this table is set up on the right-hand side, there's the prioritization, and those are those 4 criteria that I just listed, and then an overall weighting. I'm highlighting a few of the research agenda items that either scored fairly highly in our assessment or something that is part of the workshop and feedback from different agencies, whether it scored high or not, was something of interest for advancing. For the meta strategy, so you'll see on the left-hand side as we go through each of these, there's 2 groupings. There's a 5-point and then a 6-point, and anything that starts with a 5 is a meta strategy. So we break that down into these strategies that, again, impact across different coastal green infrastructure groups. And then the section 6, we go into each of the subgroups. For the meta strategy, so for instance, 5.1, the way these are set up is there's a broader mission or a broader motivation for each of these. So 5.1, there's a motivation for developing a conceptual model, what I had just discussed, and then there's what we see as 5 potential subtasks that really feed into that development and that advancement of that conceptual model. So in order to potentially break these research agendas up into pieces that are maybe manageable for DEC or DCP or other agencies to take a look at and decide they would want to advance, we tried to break these into sections that would be attainable in a given study. So really on these slides, I'm going to highlight a few details around the conceptual model, the monitoring protocol, and then also prioritization of habitats. So starting first with the conceptual model, the research agenda that we laid out with the conceptual model is really to pull the different agencies or different stakeholders together to develop a conceptual model to help essentially coordinate across different groups. So the idea would be to develop and refine a document to build a common understanding across agencies about targets, important processes, different indicators that are important to resiliency, so ecosystem and hazard mitigation related, resiliency related to ecosystems and hazard mitigation. This would be done across groups, and there was some discussion at our workshop that there are some frameworks that exist out there today that are essentially moving towards this conceptual model, that they can probably be taken in their current state and advanced further to really ensure that the work that's been done to date can be advanced, but also to understand where all the agencies can align based on the knowledge that's available and the studies that have been done to date. I jumped out of 5.2. One of the research agenda items here is specific to the development of ecosystem models, is the priority habitat coordination. And the reason I selected this of all of the research agenda items is because this one also ties to the conceptual model. So the 5.2 agenda item is intended to develop ecosystem models in a broader sense. And in order to do that, in order to successfully do that, the foundation of this really lies in how do we prioritize habitat. So how do we identify critical species? How do we understand overall agency goals and standardize and prioritize different metrics for screening each of these CGI. This ends up being, again, the foundation of kind of what's larger and what's the broader concept in 5.2, which is the advancement of more sophisticated tools, so some rapid assessment tools that you could use to compare one habitat type to another, to develop more detailed ecosystem models. And there's been some discussion of these models as of late as part of other discussions in New York. For instance, using some models like SLAM or MEM to forecast what would a marsh platform look like in the face of sea level rise. So using using our habitat understanding and our understanding of different vegetative communities to advance those tools, and also things like EcoPath or EcoSim, which are essentially fish biomass models. So as we start to think about species abundance, how can we advance these tools with, again, the foundation being set in the conceptual models and the prioritization of different habitats for New York and its various agencies. One other thing just to point out, I wanted I know I already mentioned the monitoring protocol, but I wanted to reiterate that to us, building the conceptual model, building the framework, and that the agencies can work under and work with one another as part of the conceptual model research agenda. A key part of this is also integrating this into monitoring protocol. So how can we use monitoring protocol to tie into the conceptual model? We can base our monitoring protocol on what we understand in the conceptual model. We can use what we're finding from monitoring to update our conceptual model over time, and then, of course, also update our monitoring protocol. So these things are continually advancing one another. The next set of research agenda items are here in the screens are broken down into 3 groups. So in advance of 5.1, or after 5.1 and 5.2, we have 5.3, 5.4, and 5.5. And what these are really external factors. So what are the factors, for instance, sediment, ice, and wakes, what are the factors that really impact the long-term sustainability of projects? What are the factors that impact how we design and think about projects? And so breaking each of these down into the kind of critical data that we need and the advancement of the science around these. There's some discussion, of course, of this in more detail in the agenda, but for instance, for the sediment study, the focus of the sediment study is to really understand both the sediment budget. So what is the sediment availability, and how is the sediment moving in the New York City system? How does that impact our success of these projects? What is it going to impact, for instance, the ecological benefits at given sites? Is it going to impact the long-term sustainability? And do we have enough borrow sources, for instance, to actually build and construct each of these strategies? So having an understanding on a broad regional scale, what is that sediment availability, and what does that mean in terms of project implementation is, of course, critically important. ICE study, this is one of the ones that actually ranked lowest in terms of the relative ranking at our workshop, but it's become pretty clear through conversation that this is an example of another external factor that is important to understand, again, in terms of how ICE is impacting, uprooting vegetation, and how it can impact our projects. And then the last is the vessel wake assessment. So the idea here is to build a database to understand locations in New York City where waves might be most impactful. So that would be, that of course, again, would impact how we think about the design of each of these in order to make these projects most successful and relative to their external factors, but also understanding, again, for instance, for a living shoreline, would a sill need to change because of a wake environment changing down the road because of sea level rise? So pulling these factors together, having enough information for waves and wakes out in different parts of New York City is, of course, important to understanding those successes. Some of the other items, I'm going to only hone in on a few of these in details, but we have 4 items here. Item 5.6 is cross-agency data management. I already spoke to that, but I'll add some details to that. One of them that I won't really speak much to is the 5.7, which is a comparison of marsh species. So there was, as part of this process, there was many questions related to some of the details that we were diving into as it relates to vegetation. If there is an ability to advance potentially some of our understanding of vegetation mechanics in terms of hazard mitigation or even in terms of the ecological benefits, can we advance that understanding starting with the vegetation types that are most prominent in the study area? So that's really the motivation behind 5.7. 5.8, again, I mentioned this a few times early on, the pilot project identification and implementation. So how can we select pilot projects and select them and implement them in a priority way? And then 5.9, and I won't really speak to this in much detail, but the evaluation of the regulatory processes. So that early chapter that we have in the report, what we've learned about the regulatory processes in New York, but also in other states, where are there lessons learned, and is there any flexibility in terms of how we think or move through the regulatory process in the New York area? So the cross-agency management, again, this is really motivated by some of the success stories we had seen and found in Europe and in other parts of the U.S., including San Francisco and Louisiana. And the ultimate goal here is to be able to find agency participation and leadership. We talked, for instance, the Department of State as potentially being a potential suitable partner to lead some of the management of this. But how can we put together a plan or an agenda to advance the management of different data, to have the data in similar formats, to have data housed in one place where it is collected for individual projects, find ways to store that data consistently in one location, though it's being captured for many projects. One of the things we learned as this process is, of course, as projects are initiated and data is collected, often that information that has been collected is not brought into a central pool. It typically resides with certain agencies or consultants, and sometimes may get kind of, say, lost over time. We know it's out there because of the permitting process, but we don't always have that readily available. And the idea would be to, where possible, whether in past projects or moving forward in either the design or the monitoring phase, be able to build a framework that can be shared and done in a consistent way so that we have the baseline information we need to start to develop hypotheses around these studies and these project types and really advance the science. And, of course, a way to do this in a very focused way is pilot projects, recognizing that there are limitations. There needs to be a prioritization of how we would implement different pilot projects, but one of the ways certainly we see advancing the science and really helping move the regulatory process or move towards a more seamless regulatory process by having additional data to support some of the cost and benefit analyses would be pilot projects that have sufficient data. And, of course, it's important for these projects to have these on the ground sooner than later so that the data and the lessons learned is readily available as we begin to continue to design and implement different projects and, of course, learn from these individually moving forward. The last two meta strategies are 5, 10, and 11. So these two actually to me, these are really interesting and exciting because these actually both came out of the workshop in October. So 5.10, what that is a shoreline assessment of appropriate CGIs, and I'll explain this one in a little more detail. This was part of actually a different research plan, but it was so important, and it was clear it was so important at our October workshop that we pulled this out and made it its own research agenda item. And 5.11 is the quantification of coastal resiliency. I'll discuss this in a little bit more detail as well. And then, of course, the last on this slide, I'll jump down after that and get into some of the specific lessons learned with the specific research agendas for constructed wetlands. So for the shoreline prioritization, and this is actually, New York City is beginning to do this kind of work now. As I understand it, there was, I believe, a recent RFP that was out, and it is currently underway. But the idea would be to map shorelines to understand where different CGI strategies are most applicable, where we believe they would be most successful, and what are the different risks that we would have to evaluate to understand that potential success rate of these projects. So, for instance, are they adjacent to CSOs, or are they adjacent to other factors in the urban environment that might impact the success of these? Also, understanding complexities in the nonlinear response to sea level rise. How do all these factors go together to help us understand where we should focus our efforts in terms of implementing these types of projects across the New York City coastline? The quantifying resiliency, where this came from, there's been a fair amount of discussion, and on a personal level, this is certainly the research agenda item that I have paid the most focus to since this project completed in December. It's been something that me and my team and many of the folks at Stevens Institute and others that we're collaborating with, we come across these questions quite a bit, and that really is how do we quantify the coastal resiliency benefits, specifically as it relates to hazard mitigation for these strategies. And there's, again, as I mentioned before, some gray infrastructure. There's a more cut and dry way to calculate the benefits. There's traditional, say, Corps of Engineers is the still water elevation reductions that the Corps would use to look at depth damage is a more traditional way of looking at certain strategies, but that doesn't always work necessarily with these strategies, largely because many of the impacts to storm surge are not substantial. These aren't large, big levees, for instance, and over regions. In many cases, these are smaller structures that are really impacting waves. And so what does it mean to reduce current velocities, to reduce waves? What does that mean in terms of resiliency? How can we quantify that, and how can we use that to really understand the benefits of these projects in a non-traditional way? And doing this systematically is really important, of course, to be able to do this across agencies and get buy-in and get appreciation for that type of analysis. Jumping now down to Section 6, which is, again, focused on the individual strategies, one of the ones that this certainly came out in our workshop, the strategy, the advancement that most people were interested in at that workshop was how do we understand flow resistance of marshes, our wetlands, and maritime forests. And there's a tremendous amount of literature out there that really describes vegetative resistance and explains or tries to understand the difference between potential impact or fragmented marshes and wetlands, and how do these things impact how we think about gradual erosion, or again, hazard mitigation on an episodic for different episodes. And advancing this, continuing to advance this science is certainly one of the things that we would recommend for the broader community. And then the last slide, and then we'll open it up for questions after this, is the research agenda items for the other five, for the other strategies. So we have the reefs, dredge channel shallowing. We do actually have a research agenda item for breakwater islands, and the reason for that is they all fall within either the meta strategies or can be addressed through some of these other strategy-specific research agenda items, for instance, those in wetlands. But also, and then concluding with ecologically enhanced bulkheads, revetments, and living shorelines. And focus really, I know I just jumped a lot of the strategies, but some of the key research agenda items have been addressed in the meta. So the big one here, and this really came out again in our workshop in October in the discussions at that time and since, is how can we as a community define standard guidelines for living shorelines? So how do we improve this? And this is something that Stevens Institute from our team has really been the thought leaders on, but really understanding how do we improve our understanding of what the stone size should be, knowing our waves and our wakes and our ice, and knowing the environment you're operating in, your armoring depth, your vegetation maintenance. So the vegetation maintenance in terms of, again, the risk of uprooting or vegetation in some cases, rather than uprooting, you'd have the opposite problem where vegetation might be too dense and there might be some issues or concerns about the integrity of the enhanced structure because of vegetation. So making sure we understand that. We have a maintenance guideline around these. Also, and there's some other design things, for instance, for living shorelines, like window spacing and distance of seals from the shoreline. So how do we optimize these to not only improve, again, our hazard mitigation, our erosion of our shorelines, or are there concerns on that end, but how do you do it in a way that is most ecologically beneficial? So with that, I'm going to turn it back. Actually, I'm not sure if I'll be turning it back to Kristin or to Mike, but I will turn it back to NEIWPCC.
All right. I am going to take control back from Hugh, and Jessica is unmuted. So Jessica, if you wouldn't mind, I'm going to put you on the spot. We have determined that Kristin is having a browser compatibility issue, so that's why she's unable to join the audio portion of the conference. She's listening in. My apologies, but we're not going to be able to have her lay out the next steps, but maybe Jessica, you could capture the next steps on her behalf. And
sure, yeah.
What I will do is make sure that folks have access to Kristin's contact information if after the webinar people want to follow up with her one-on-one.
Sure. So just in terms of a few next steps, so we were really pleased with the outcome of this report, but as I'm sure you all realize, there's a lot of information in it, and figuring out exactly the best way to use it is a challenge and something we need to sort of bring together different stakeholders to figure out. So DEC, Hudson River Estuary Program, has secured a grant to advance this work. They've hired the Consensus Building Institute to assist with a strategic planning effort to interview stakeholders and identify ways to move this plan forward in the years to come. We've been continuing to work, DEC, the city at the Department of City Planning, and we've also brought in the New York, New Jersey Harbor and Estuary Program to partner on this. And it's an ongoing effort. We're strategizing, and we are definitely open to ideas and suggestions about ways to partner and advance some of these agenda items. So if anyone has any questions, or I think this might be a good time to start with that.
And this is Hugh. I think in order to ask questions, lines are not, I don't think can be unmuted, if I'm correct, Mike. So questions would have to come through chat unless Mike's able to unmute all lines. That's the only options.
I've been talking for the last 5 minutes with the phone muted, so people can't hear me. This is an opportunity to send questions via chat. I'll see them in Lowell and let folks know what's going on relative to the questions, and then try to unmute the individuals if we can. But I noticed that a great deal of folks really aren't connected via the audio portion that would allow me to then unmute them without just throwing it out to 130 people at random. So for folks that didn't hear what I had to say, Kristin is having a web browser compatibility issue, so she's not able to join us, but I'm going to make her information available. Thank you to Hugh and Kristin and Jessica. We have received a couple of questions along the way, so I'm just going to go through those, and then, again, if folks want to send chat questions, we'll look to compile them here. I've been receiving chat messages, so I assume that folks can send them to me through that function. One of the questions came in was, Hugh, on your 4 categories, the scoring range for principles, chronology, applicability, and affordability, that was a range of 1 to 3?
It was I apologize for not saying that. The one that was not 1 to 3 was the fundamental principles. That was either a 1 or a 0. And the reason for that was that, to us, in talking with our partners as well, that wasn't really something that maybe would impact the decision whether this is a type of agenda we'd want to carry forward. But we wanted to have it there as something to kind of guide our thoughts. It really helps us understand how much it will advance the science in a in a larger sense, but also that also comes with potentially some greater challenges because there might be less to work from, and so we used it to categorize it in that way.
Okay. One of the questions that we received in the course of the presentation was relative to a download of the document. Folks were having a difficult time. It is in WebEx. You have access to it there, but I've learned that folks might be having a problem with that. The document is on the New York State DEC website, and I will send a message to everybody afterwards with the link to the DEC website, so you'll have access to the document that way as well. But I have a question here for you, Hugh. Can you give more details on habitat prioritization?
Sure. That's kind of it's a broad one, but so the idea here, there's a few different topics that came up. One is that in terms of say understanding habitats, we know that, for instance, more of one habitat is better than say less of it. But one of the challenges we had heard in our conversations was when we begin to talk about different habitat types. So a habitat you might see, say, in a maritime forest versus a wetland versus an in-water habitat. When you begin to compare costs and benefits of either habitat impacts or habitat benefits from some of these strategies or a combination of strategies, how do we compare them? And as a community, how do we understand and recognize maybe what some of the priority habitats might be? And the reason for that is not necessarily always that one is more important or better than another in terms of a comparative standpoint, but really to help guide through the regulatory process or guide through an improvement of how we can quantify the performance of different habitats. So I hope that answered the question, but that's certainly one of the biggest challenges. And we want to, by the way, and one thing I guess I should add is we mentioned one of the research agenda items is, for instance, a rapid assessment tool. There are many rapid assessment tools that are out there. What we're encouraging is that, for instance, there is a rapid assessment tool or set of tools that would be used consistently across agencies to really incorporate a consistent prioritization or comparison of habitat types.
Okay. Any other questions? We're sort of nearing the end here, but we do have a couple of minutes if folks have a question they'd like to pose. And I will just sort of reiterate what's on the screen here, that we have recorded this webinar. We're going to create a landing page for it off of our research website, where the folks that are interested but couldn't join us today will be able to listen to the presentation. We've had questions about whether we would distribute the presentation to individuals, and I think what I would prefer to do is get it on the web page as well, so we could have seminar-related information in one place where you could get the report, the presentation, and the recording of the webinar. So we'll do that. And again, the best way to sort of stay in the loop on that is to follow the New England Interstate Twitter feed, which is up there as well. So we had another question come in. Can you tell us more about quantification of coastal resiliency?
Yeah, so the quantification of resiliency, there have been some advancements even since this was put together, but say on the quantification, one of the challenges that we've seen is that in some study areas, for instance, your depth of flooding is not impacted by these types of projects. What is impacted is potentially the flow speed, the current velocities, and the wave climate, so the amount of energy essentially in the water column. And that, of course, as we think about resiliency, the idea for quantifying is in again, we're starting to try to do this now. There's been some literature that's come out even since the completion of this project in the Netherlands, trying to quantify in a consistent way resiliency from features like this. So what we would be aiming to do is, rather than a traditional economic assessment, which usually bases the quantification or the benefit of projects based on a flood depth and then what the associated damage is with the depth, adding details to that formula, essentially, where it becomes a function of not just depth, but the energy in the water column, the wave climate, and the example that has come up in a few projects is, if you had a flood depth of, say, 3 feet at your house, that's a lot different than a flood depth of 3 feet with the wave climate on top of it that potentially is moving debris, in and around the area that could be considerably more destructive. And so, based upon literature that is out there, we do believe that you could quantify that and really understand what the reduction in energy means for the overall resiliency of an area. And again, by resiliency, it's essentially less damages and the ability to bounce back more quickly because that damage has been reduced through features like these. And just one thing too is there is a resiliency tool. There's some others that are working on this, and I don't know all the specifics, and unfortunately I'm assuming they can't actually discuss, but the TNC also has a resiliency tool, the Nature Conservancy, that can be used for this type of quantification.
Okay, great. Still have a minute or two for questions if there's any more. I'm not going to keep the line open for 5 minutes if we don't have it, but if you have any more questions, feel free to send them in. We'll give it a moment or two for it to work its way through the WebEx system to us. While we're doing that, again, I want to say thank you very much, Hugh. Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Kristin. Thank you to everybody that joined us today. I think this went well, with the exception of a minor glitch here or two, but again, this was our debut, and that's kind of how you work the bugs out. I've been keeping an eye on the participant total, and at one point I did see there were 170 people that participated. I think that's fantastic, and I really appreciate everyone that joined in. It looks like some folks are trying to send a message. Couple of messages here that aren't particularly project specific, how to get involved in the work. Maybe that's something that Jessica could speak to, and then any plans for project funding for research related to this work. So that would not be something that the New England Interstate Water Pollution Control Commission would have access to, but there may be other work that's going on, and then Jessica, maybe if you wouldn't mind being put on the spot, could expand on that a little bit.
Sure. So the best way to get involved, I would just say, is to follow up with either Kristin or myself following this call. Our contact information is in the presentation, and or you can reach out to Mike, and he can put you in touch with us. That would just be the best way to do that. In terms of funding opportunities, the Hudson River Foundation in their latest grant cycle has been using this report as sort of a guide for some of their grants this cycle. I believe that it's already closed at this point, but continue to look out for opportunities that are sort of using this as a base. We're going to try to advertise this more as well, and Mike, maybe you can help us with that, but that's one place where this is sort of right now going into grants. And then we're also looking for opportunities that grant programs can align with this work in ways that others who give out grants can help use this work and use this research plan to advance it.
Great. I appreciate that. I have several folks have sent me links to the DEC website where the report can be downloaded rather than spit out a big lengthy website over the phone. I will send a follow-up message to everyone that registered that contains that website, maybe even attach the report to it, but get the report out as best we can, and then also explore the possibility of sending the presentation out to folks. My preference is to have folks come to the NEIWPCC website to download that, but we can at least get the website out to everyone and probably ask a couple of survey-type questions in regards to the premiere of our research webinar series. So I'm going to cut off the questions and answers at this point. Again, say thank you to everybody that spoke or participated. I think this went great, and we look forward to doing more of these. So thanks again, Hugh and Jessica and Kristin. And again, at this point, I'm going to conclude the webinar, and have a nice day.
Thanks.
Thanks, Mike.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.